The eviction notice felt heavy in my hands as I watched Rebecca strut around our childhood home like she owned it. Well, technically she did now, according to the will she presented at the estate lawyer's office this morning. Don't worry, she said, examining her perfectly manicured nails. I'm giving you a full month to clear out, even though Dad's will only require 2 weeks. See, I can be generous. My name is Sophie Anderson, and at 34, I was watching my older sister dismantle my entire life with a few pieces of paper and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Our father, James Anderson, had passed away 3 weeks ago after a brief battle with cancer. The loss was devastating enough. But now this. I don't understand, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. Dad always said he was leaving the house to both of us. He wanted us to share it. Rebecca rolled her eyes, settling into Dad's favorite leather armchair like she was trying it on for size. People change their minds, Sophie. Dad finally realized which daughter actually deserved his legacy. I looked around the study where we stood, Dad's sanctuary filled with his books, his collection of antique maps, and a lingering scent of his favorite pipe tobacco. This room held more memories than I could count. It was where he'd taught me to play chess, where he'd helped me with my homework, where he'd consoled me after my divorce 2 years ago. When did he make this change? I asked, though I already knew the answer. I just wanted to hear her say it. 3 months ago, Rebecca replied smugly. Right after his diagnosis, he called me over one evening and said he needed to make things right. Said he'd been foolish trying to split everything equally when clearly one of us was more capable. I nodded slowly, remembering that evening well. Dad had been heavily medicated, barely able to hold a conversation. Yet somehow he'd managed to not only change his will but make it heavily favor Rebecca, leaving her the house, his investment portfolio, and controlling interest in the family business. All I got was a small savings account and Dad's old car. What about the business? I asked, though I knew what was coming. Of that, Rebecca waved her hand dismissively. The board already approved my appointment as CEO. After all, I have been running things while you were off playing artist. I bit back a retort. My playing artist had actually been running a successful graphic design firm for the past 8 years. But Rebecca had always dismissed it as a hobby. In her world, if you weren't wearing a power suit and making other people miserable, you weren't really working. I'll need the keys to the house, she continued, holding out her hand. All copies, please, and don't even think about making extras. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my keyring, carefully removing the house key I'd had since I was 12. But as I did, my fingers brushed against another key, smaller, older, almost forgotten. The key to Dad's private safe. Rebecca didn't know about that safe. Nobody did, except me and Dad. He'd shown it to me on my 30th birthday, hidden behind one of his beloved antique maps. Keep this between us, he'd said with a wink. Sometimes a person needs a place for their real treasures. I handed Rebecca my house key, watching as she practically snatched it from my fingers. I'll have my things out by the end of the month, I said quietly. Make sure you do, she replied, standing up and straightening her designer blazer. I'm having the locks changed tomorrow anyway, but I'd hate to have to call the police if you overstay your welcome. As she clicked her way out of the study in her expensive heels, I waited until I heard the front door close. Then I counted to 100, making sure she was really gone. Only then did I move to the far wall, where Dad's prized 1847 map of London hung in its heavy wooden frame. My hands were steady as I lifted it carefully, revealing the small wall safe behind it. The old key fit perfectly, just as it had countless times before. But this time, when I opened the safe, I wasn't looking for the family photos or childhood mementos Dad kept there. I was looking for the envelope he placed inside 3 weeks ago, just days before he died. Sophie, he'd whispered from his hospital bed, pressing the envelope into my hands. Put this in the safe. Don't tell your sister. Promise me. I promised, though I hadn't looked inside the envelope at the time. I was too focused on his failing health, on trying to make his last days comfortable. But now, the envelope was exactly where I'd left it, tucked behind a stack of old photographs. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it, pulling out several documents that would change everything. The first was a will, Dad's real will, dated just 2 weeks before his death and properly notarized. But it wasn't the will that made my breath catch in my throat. It was the second document, A detailed record of financial transactions spanning the past 5 years, all in Dad's meticulous handwriting. And at the top, a single sentence that made my blood run cold. Evidence of Rebecca's embezzlement from Anderson Global, estimated total, $2.7 million. There was more: bank statements, transfer records, copies of forged signatures. Dad had been building this file for years, documenting every penny Rebecca had stolen from the company. But the final document was what really made my hands shake. It was a letter written in Dad's distinctive scrawl. My dearest Sophie, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and Rebecca has probably already tried to take everything. I'm so sorry I couldn't stop her myself, but the cancer moved too quickly. The real will is here, along with everything I've gathered about her theft from the company. I've known about it for years, but I could never bring myself to turn her in. She's still my daughter, despite everything. But I won't let her steal your inheritance too. The proof is all here. Use it wisely. I love you both, but you were always the stronger one, the one who could make the hard choices. Take care of our family's legacy. Love, Dad. I sat down in Dad's leather chair, the one Rebecca had so casually claimed earlier, and began to read through everything carefully. With each page, the full scope of her deception became clearer. She hadn't just forged the will. She'd been systematically draining company accounts for years, covering her tracks with fake investments and non-existent projects. Dad had caught on early but had chosen to document everything instead of confronting her. Maybe he'd hoped she'd stop on her own. Maybe he'd been trying to protect her in his own way. But in the end, he'd made sure the truth would come out. I pulled out my phone and called the one person I knew I could trust with this, Mark Reynolds, Dad's oldest friend and the family's longtime lawyer. "We need to talk," I said when he answered. "It's about Dad's will. The real one." Mark Reynolds' office hadn't changed in 20 years. The same dark wood paneling, the same leather chairs, even the same slightly crooked painting of a sailing ship that had fascinated me as a child. But today, as he reviewed the documents I'd brought him, the familiar surroundings offered little comfort. "This is extraordinary," Mark said finally, looking up from the papers spread across his desk. James documented everything meticulously. The forged signatures, the fake accounts, even the offshore transfers. He didn't miss a detail. I nodded, thinking of all those evenings Dad had spent working late in his study. He hadn't been just managing the business, he'd been building a case against his own daughter. "What about the will she presented this morning?" I asked. "The one leaving her everything?" Mark's expression darkened. "A forgery, without question. A good one, but still fake. The notary stamp is perfect, but the signature—" He pulled out a magnifying glass, examining the document closely. James's real signature had a distinctive loop in the J. This one's missing it. Plus, the date coincides with when he was heavily medicated. He could barely hold a pen, let alone sign legal documents. "So what do we do?" Mark leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "We have two options. We can go straight to the police with evidence of both the forged will and the embezzlement, or—" He paused, studying my face. "We can handle this more strategically." I thought about Rebecca's smug expression as she'd handed me the eviction notice. About all the years she'd dismissed my work, my choices, my entire life as somehow less valuable than hers. "Tell me about strategic," I said. Mark outlined the plan carefully. First, we would quietly file Dad's real will with the probate court, but request a delay in processing. This would prevent Rebecca from making any irreversible decisions about the estate while giving us time to build our case. Next, we would conduct a full audit of Anderson Global's finances, documenting every instance of theft and fraud. Mark would bring in forensic accountants he trusted, ones who knew how to be discreet. "The key," he explained, "is to have everything in place before she realizes what's happening. Once we move, we need to move fast." I spent the next 2 weeks playing along with Rebecca's narrative. I began packing boxes, making a show of preparing to move out. Meanwhile, Mark's team worked tirelessly, unraveling the complex web of financial deception Rebecca had woven. The numbers were staggering. Beyond the $2.7 million Dad had documented, they found another $1 million hidden in various shell companies and fake consulting contracts. Rebecca hadn't just been stealing. She built an entire shadow operation within the company. 15 days after receiving the eviction notice, I got the call I'd been waiting for. "We're ready," Mark said simply. The board meets tomorrow at 10 a.m. Be there. That night, as I sat in Dad's study supposedly packing his books, Rebecca stopped by to check on my progress. "You're being very mature about this," she said, watching me wrap Dad's first edition Hemingways in bubble wrap. "I was worried you'd make a scene." I carefully placed another book in a box. "What would be the point? The will is clear, isn't it?" She smiled, that same self-satisfied smile she'd worn since we were children whenever she got her way. "I'm glad you understand. Once you're gone, you should really consider selling Dad's car. I could recommend some dealers." "I'll keep that in mind," I replied, fighting to keep my voice neutral. "By the way, aren't you running late for your dinner with the board members?" Her eyes widened slightly. "How did you know about that?" I shrugged. "Oh, I still talk to people at the company. They keep me updated." Something flickered across her face. Doubt, maybe even fear. But she masked it quickly. "Well, yes, just a routine dinner, making sure everything transitions smoothly." If she only knew how smooth the transition would be. The Anderson Global boardroom was intimidating by design. All gleaming mahogany and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Rebecca had always loved it, the way it made people feel small. Today, as I took my seat at the far end of the table, I watched her hold court at the head, completely unaware of what was coming. "Now that everyone's here," she began, shuffling some papers importantly, "I'd like to discuss our 5-year growth strategy." Actually, Mark interrupted, rising from his seat. "There's been a change to the agenda." Rebecca's perfectly penciled eyebrows drew together in confusion. "Excuse me?" "I set the agenda, and I don't recall." "The first item," Mark continued as if she hadn't spoken, "is the matter of James Anderson's will. The real one." The color drained from Rebecca's face as Mark began distributing copies of Dad's authentic will to each board member. I watched as her hands began to shake slightly, though she tried to hide it by gripping the edge of the table. "This is ridiculous," she sputtered. "We've already been through this. The will was read weeks ago." "That will," I said quietly, speaking for the first time, "was a forgery. Just like the signatures on all those transfer documents you've been using to steal from the company." The room went deadly silent. One by one, the board members began examining the documents in front of them. Not just the will, but the extensive evidence of Rebecca's embezzlement that Mark's team had compiled. "These are very serious allegations," Thomas Chin, the head of the board, said gravely. "Ms. Anderson, do you have any explanation for these discrepancies?" Rebecca's composure cracked. "This is absurd. Sophie's just jealous because Dad chose me to run the company. She's always been jealous of my success." Success? I couldn't help but laugh. "Is that what you call stealing nearly $4 million from our family's company? I built this company," she shrieked, jumping to her feet. "While you were playing with your little art projects, I was here every day, making the hard decisions. Like the decision to create fake consulting firms to funnel money into your personal accounts." Mark asked mildly, sliding another document across the table. "Or the decision to forge Dad's signature on international wire transfers." Rebecca's eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal's, looking for an ally, an escape route, anything. But she found only shocked and disgusted faces. "Dad knew," I said softly. "He knew everything, Rebecca. He documented it all. But instead of turning you in, he protected you. Right until the end, he was trying to protect you. Then why?" Her voice cracked. "Why reveal it now? Because you couldn't stop, could you? Even after he died, you had to take more. You forged his will, tried to steal my inheritance, and planned to continue bleeding the company dry." Thomas Chen cleared his throat. "The police are waiting in the lobby. Mr. Reynolds has already provided them with copies of all documentation." Rebecca collapsed back into her chair, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. "You can't do this," she whispered. "I'm your sister." "Yes, you are," I replied, standing up. "And you'll always be my sister. But Dad trusted me to protect his legacy, the real one, not the empire you tried to build on lies and theft." As the police led Rebecca away in handcuffs, I remained in the boardroom, staring out at the city below. The same view she'd loved so much, the one she thought proved her superiority. The aftermath was exactly what you'd expect. Rebecca was charged with multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and forgery. She took a plea deal to avoid a lengthy trial, but still ended up with 8 years in prison. The house, my house now, according to Dad's real will, felt different without the weight of secrets. I kept his study exactly as it was, right down to the antique map hiding the safe. Sometimes I sit in his leather chair, remembering how he taught me that strength isn't about dominating others, but about doing what's right, even when it's hard. Mark helped me restructure the company, implementing new financial controls and bringing in fresh talent. Anderson Global not only survived the scandal but thrived, partly because employees no longer had to work under Rebecca's toxic leadership. A year after everything happened, I received a letter from Rebecca's prison. Her handwriting, once so precise and controlled, was shaky. Dear Sophie, I've had a lot of time to think in here. About Dad, about what I did, about who I became. I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not sure I even deserve it. But I want you to know that I understand now. Dad chose the right person to protect his legacy. I'm sorry for everything. Rebecca. I keep the letter in Dad's safe, along with all the other family documents that matter. Not because I've forgiven her, that will take time, if it ever comes, but because it's part of our story now. A reminder that sometimes the hardest choices are the right ones. The company continues to grow, but differently now. We've established a foundation in Dad's name that provides art education grants to underprivileged kids. My little art projects are finally being put to good use, designing materials for the foundation's programs. Late at night, when I'm working in Dad's study, I sometimes imagine I can smell his pipe tobacco, feel his presence in the room. I think he'd be proud, not just of how I handled Rebecca's betrayal, but of how I'm moving our family's legacy forward. The antique map still hangs on the wall, hiding its secrets, but now it reminds me of something else Dad used to say. The truth always finds its way to the surface. The only question is whether you'll be ready when it does. I was ready, and because of that, everything he worked for, everything he believed in, lives on. As for Rebecca, she'll be eligible for parole in 4 years. I don't know if she's really changed, if prison has taught her what Dad tried so hard to teach her about integrity and responsibility. But I do know this: when she gets out, she'll find that the door to Dad's study, my study now, is still open, because that's what family does. We leave the door open, even when we're not sure anyone deserves to walk through it. That's the real legacy Dad left us. Not the money, not the company, but the understanding that true strength lies in being able to do the right thing, even when it breaks your heart. And that's a lesson worth protecting.